Hi everyone. American entry into the Second World War had a profound impact upon the country. We're going to do a quick overview of how the United States became involved in the war, and then we'll look at some aspects of the war's impact on American society. So, most history books consider September 1st, 1939 to be the beginning of the Second World War. Certainly it was in Europe, although you can make an argument that the war actually had started several years earlier with Japan's invasion of China in 1931. But this marked the beginning of the war in Europe, with Germany's invasion provoking a declaration of war in response from Great Britain and France. So this happened over Labor Day weekend in the United States, and Franklin Roosevelt made a radio address to the nation. She made an interesting statement, pledging that the United States would remain neutral, but at the same time saying he couldn't ask Americans to remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral has a right to take account of facts, Roosevelt said. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or close his conscience. We had a short discussion about this in class, and I was pointing out to the class the importance of this statement, where rhetorically Roosevelt is telling the American public there's a moral element here. There's a clear right and wrong. There's an aggressor, Nazi Germany, and there are nations on the other side, Great Britain and France, rallying to the defense of Poland. So the majority of Americans were opposed to entry into another European war, as we had done late in World War I. And that's reflected in this cartoon that I shared with the class from the Chicago Tribune's leading cartoonist, Carrie Orr. Chicago Tribune at this time was one of the leading conservative pro-Republican papers in the country, staunchly anti-Roosevelt, opposed to the New Deal, and this cartoon captures the feelings of those Americans wanting the United States to remain out of the war, with Lady Liberty here, Lady Democracy, kneeling at the feet of Uncle Sam, begging him to stay out. Germany conquered Poland in a little over a month, and I mentioned in class not much happened in the war for several months over the winter of 1939 into 1940. And then in the spring of 1940, German armed forces launched massive attacks into Scandinavia, conquering Denmark and Norway, and then quickly into Western Europe, overrunning Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and most shockingly to the American public, France, which was defeated in a little over a month from May to June 1940. And I say this was shocking to the United States and the American public because France was considered really the primary counterbalance on the continent to Nazi Germany. And France had held out against Germany for 4 years during World War I. So seeing France defeated this rapidly, the sight of this large German victory parade through the streets of Paris, scenes of Hitler touring the city and taking in the sights, this did have a shock effect on the American public, although it didn't change the overwhelming sentiment of the public to remain out of the war. What the defeat of France did do, though, was make the American public more accepting of the idea of the United States assisting Great Britain, which was now fighting Germany alone. Britain had a change in political leadership with a new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, coming to power, and one of Churchill's first objectives was to establish an effective working relationship with Franklin Roosevelt, which he did. Over the years, these two would have strong disagreements, but their working relationship was critical to this pre-war period and to the success of the Allied coalition later on. They corresponded frequently, usually spoke by phone multiple times per week too. And I have the picture here of St. Paul's Cathedral in London looming up amidst a Nazi bombing raid. German bombing of London and other British cities stimulated intense sympathy here in the United States, and American churches, relief agencies like the Red Cross organized these collections of all sorts of things, drives for everything from books to clothing to food, to be sent to the British people as they suffered through the German bombing. So what Roosevelt begins doing during this period is very cautiously moving the United States into more direct support of Britain. All these measures were controversial. At the time, some of Roosevelt's critics accused him of deliberately trying to maneuver the United States into the war. I've never believed that. As a historian, Roosevelt had a deep abhorrence and hatred of war. I mentioned in our Zoom session one of his most famous speeches from the mid-1930s is a speech called the I Hate War speech. But Roosevelt was also a pragmatist and a realist, and he was feeling that the longer this war went on and the more it expanded, the less likely it was the United States would be able to remain disengaged. Here in America, one of the groups most vocal about American participation in the war was the America First Committee. This was a lobbying organization with over 400 chapters across the country and engaged in telephoning, letter writing campaigns, rallies. They worked at both the state and national level, meeting and lobbying with members of U.S. Congress and senators to convey their opposition to American participation in the war. And one of the most famous spokespeople for this group was the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh. I mentioned in class, Lindbergh is regarded still as this iconic figure, and hero in St. Louis. It's a very complex person. Lindbergh was intensely anti-Semitic and made a number of ugly speeches during this period, accusing Jews of having provoked the outbreak of the war. After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, he's going to completely change his views. So there was a growing debate in the American public, and I shared these cartoons during our Zoom session, 2 political cartoons done by an illustrator named Theodore Geisel, who even when he did these cartoons was using the name Dr. Seuss and would later become extremely famous author of a whole series of successful children's books. But both of these cartoons, can take a look at this, are examples of making fun of the America First position, with the woman on the cartoon on the left even wearing, a sweater labeled America First, reading this book to her terrified-looking children, Adolf the Wolf, and telling them, it doesn't matter because those were foreign children. On the right, got this creature who resembles a Sneetch from one of his later books, sitting peacefully in his chair while the world is going up in flames around him. So this was the minority view. They say the majority of the American public was still wanting to remain out of the war, but it reflects a growing uneasiness here in the United States and a rapidly expanding debate about whether the United States could remain out of the war. So the first steps Roosevelt takes directly to aid Britain include the Destroyer for Bases deal, which Eric Foner talks about too. You've read how there were a whole series of federal laws, the neutrality laws, that made it illegal for the United States to supply weaponry or war material to a country at war, even if that nation was the victim of aggression. So to get around that, Roosevelt, through an executive order, sends to Britain 50 destroyers, which was a small highly maneuverable, fast naval ship used especially for escorting convoys of cargo ships and used in anti-submarine warfare, desperately needed by the British, who were under a submarine blockade by Nazi Germany. So he does this in exchange for the United States being able to use several British bases here in the Western Hemisphere. More importantly, and even much larger, was Roosevelt's successful passage of a piece of legislation, the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, that gave Roosevelt executive authority to supply Britain with anything he thought the country needed. This was extremely controversial. Once it's passed, the majority of the American public does support it, but it hugely broadened Roosevelt's executive authority, and billions of dollars of supplies began flowing to Great Britain under the Lend-Lease Act. In fact, after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union during the summer of 1941, Lend-Lease was extended to the Soviet Union as well. Though it's a major, major step, again, a measure short of war, but one that brings the United States into a more directly supporting role of the Allied war effort against Nazi Germany. And Roosevelt had his first meeting with Winston Churchill in 1941. They each came by ship and met in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Newfoundland and produced an agreement called the Atlantic Charter. It's an amazing document because it's really a joint declaration of what they want the world to look like when the war is over. So kind of a declaration of war aims, even though we're not in the war. And again, controversial. The American public, for the most part, went along with it. People would have been even more alarmed had they realized that Roosevelt secretly had also authorized American military strategists to begin discussions and planning sessions with their British counterparts. Congress didn't know about this, the American public didn't know about it, and these plans became the basis of Allied strategy once the United States was in the war. So, in that sense, they were beneficial. In another sense, they set an unfortunate precedent of using secrecy in a way that Presidents John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson would do to expand American participation in the Vietnam War in the 1960s. So, as I mentioned, while Roosevelt's actions were controversial, for the most part, the American public went along with these, even though there was criticism of all these steps, with critics charging that Roosevelt's actions were making American participation in the war more likely, those who supported Roosevelt arguing that he was helping to protect American security. So this is a question I want you to ask yourself when you're considering this material that I've presented and what you've read from Eric Foner's book. Do you think Roosevelt's actions did they have the result of making American participation in the war more likely, as critics charged, or were they, as Roosevelt and his supporters said, a way for the United States to support the Allies without becoming directly involved?